you dance this, I'll give you $100 million, the millionaire joked. The maid's daughter did, and his jaw dropped to the floor. It began with a joke meant to humiliate. This is what happens when you hire from the bottom of the barrel, sneered billionaire Harrison Vanderbilt, his voice echoing through the crystal-lit ballroom of the Vanderbilt Astoria. The crowd laughed nervously as he pointed at Carol Peterson, a hotel maid frozen in shame, clutching a tray of empty glasses. If you can dance better than my wife, I'll give you $100 million. But if you can't, you're fired. 200 of New York's elite looked on, some amused, others horrified. And then, from the shadows, came a voice clear as glass. She won't dance. But I will. A 10-year-old girl stepped forward, standing between her mother and one of the most powerful men in America. This is the story of how a child's courage defied cruelty and changed everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A little girl stood against a giant, her courage the only weapon she had. She was about to accept a challenge that could save her mother's life or destroy them both. The world held its breath, wondering if a child's spirit could truly move a mountain of greed. The grand ballroom of the Vanderbilt Astoria Hotel glittered with a cold, sharp light. It was a light that bounced off diamond necklaces and reflected in glasses of champagne that cost more than a month's rent. The air itself seemed heavy, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, confident hum of old money. 200 of New York's most powerful figures were gathered for the annual Vanderbilt Foundation Gala, an event that was less about charity and more about celebrating the immense wealth of one man, Harrison Vanderbilt III. Harrison, a man whose tailored suit was as sharp as his tongue, surveyed the room from his perch near the stage. His face, etched with the permanent scowl of someone who had never been told no, scanned the crowd. He wasn't looking at his guests. He was inspecting them, judging the quality of their jewels, the sincerity of their smiles. To him, people were assets or liabilities, and tonight, everyone was an asset, their presence adding another layer of polish to his formidable reputation. He was a king in his crystal castle, and he enjoyed the view. In the shadows, near a service corridor, a different world existed. Here, the air smelled of bleach and quiet desperation. Carol Peterson, a maid at the hotel for the past 6 years, moved with a practiced invisibility. At 42, her hands were chapped and her back ached with a permanent, dull throb, but her movements were efficient, her face a mask of professional calm. She refilled ice buckets and cleared away abandoned glasses, her path a silent, looping dance around the edges of celebration. Her only goal was to get through the night without being noticed. To be noticed was to risk a complaint, and a complaint could mean losing her job. Losing her job was a catastrophe she couldn't afford to imagine. Tucked away in a small supply closet, her daughter, Emily, sat on an overturned bucket. At 10 years old, Emily was a whisper of a girl, with hair the color of pale corn silk and eyes the color of a summer sky. She was supposed to be with Mrs. Gable next door, but the elderly woman had fallen ill at the last minute. Carol had no other choice. She had brought Emily to work, hiding her away with a worn copy of The Secret Garden and a stern warning to stay silent and out of sight. Emily wasn't reading. She was listening to the muffled sounds of the orchestra, her small foot tapping a rhythm against the concrete floor. She could feel the vibrations of the bass through the soles of her worn sneakers. In her mind, she was on that dance floor, not as a guest, but as a performer. She imagined herself spinning under the grand chandeliers, her simple dress transformed into a costume of flowing silk. It was a secret dream, one she and her mother rarely spoke of anymore. It was a dream from before the sickness, before the mountain of bills had buried them. The sickness had come for her father first, a swift and merciless cancer that had stolen him and every penny of their savings. Then, it had come for Carol. Not a cancer, but a persistent, debilitating illness that required treatments not fully covered by her meager insurance. The debt was a living thing, a monster that grew larger every month. It was the reason for the double shifts, the reason Emily was sitting in a closet instead of a warm bed, the reason the light in her mother's eyes seemed to be dimming. Carol entered the closet, her face etched with exhaustion. "Just a few more hours, sweetie," she whispered, handing Emily a small bottle of water. Are you doing okay? Emily nodded, forcing a smile. I'm fine, Mom. I can hear the music. A flicker of pain crossed Carol's face. Before, they had always had music in their small apartment. Her husband, Frank, had loved to waltz with her in the kitchen. And Emily was born to dance. From the time she could walk, she moved with a grace that seemed otherworldly. Frank's father, a decorated war veteran, had been the one to notice it first. That girl has lightning in her feet and steel in her spine, Sergeant Frank Peterson Sr. used to say, his voice gruff with pride. He had taught Emily her first steps, not ballroom dances, but routines he created himself, based on discipline, strength, and storytelling. Every step has a purpose, little soldier, he'd tell her. Don't just dance. Speak. But the sergeant was gone now, and the dance lessons had stopped 2 years ago. There was no money for classes, no energy left after long shifts, and a constant, heavy fear that Emily might injure herself. An injury, even a small one, was a cost they could not bear. Carol's thoughts were shattered by a sudden, sharp gasp from the ballroom, followed by a man's furious roar. Her heart clenched. She hurried out of the closet, Emily peeking out from behind her. It was worse than she could have imagined. A waiter, young and nervous, had tripped. His tray of drinks had gone flying, arcing through the air in a spray of red wine and shattered glass. And the target, the epicenter of the disaster, was Harrison Vanderbilt III. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across the front of his pristine white tuxedo shirt. The music screeched to a halt. A heavy, dreadful silence fell over the 200 guests. All eyes were on Harrison, whose face was contorted into a mask of pure fury. You incompetent fool, he bellowed, his voice echoing through the vast space. The young waiter was pale, stammering apologies that no one could hear. Get him out of here. Fired, Harrison commanded, waving a dismissive hand. 2 security guards moved in, gently but firmly escorting the tearful young man away. The event manager, a man named Mr. Davies, rushed forward with a cloth. Mr. Vanderbilt, my deepest apologies. A terrible accident. Harrison snatched the cloth and dabbed uselessly at his shirt. Accident. This is what happens when you hire from the bottom of the barrel, Davies. Incompetence. That's the disease of the working class. He scanned the room, his eyes blazing. His gaze landed on the nearest staff member. It was Carol Peterson, who had been frozen in place by the scene, a tray of empty glasses still in her hands. You. Harrison snapped, pointing a finger at her. Cleaning lady. Come here. Carol's blood ran cold. She slowly walked forward, her body trembling. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the sea of curious, judgmental faces. Look at this, Harrison said, gesturing to his ruined shirt as if it were a mortal wound. This is a $5,000 shirt. Do you know how many floors you'd have to scrub to afford a shirt like this? Carol remained silent, her shame a lead weight in her stomach. I asked you a question, he sneered. Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd. I don't know, sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Of course you don't, he scoffed. People like you don't think in those terms. You just exist. You plod along, day after day, with no grace, no elegance, no understanding of the finer things. He began to circle her like a shark, enjoying the spectacle he was creating. The initial shock among the guests was starting to curdle into a kind of morbid entertainment. Look at the way you stand, he continued, his voice dripping with contempt. All hunched over. No posture. I bet you couldn't even walk across this floor without tripping over your own feet. You people have no rhythm, no coordination. From the doorway of the supply closet, Emily watched, her small hands clenched into fists. Tears of anger and helplessness welled in her eyes as she saw her mother, her strong, kind mother, being treated like an object of scorn. Her mother, who worked until her body screamed in pain just to keep them fed. Her mother, who hummed lullabies to her at night, even when she was so tired she could barely stand. Harrison stopped in front of Carol, a cruel, brilliant idea lighting up his eyes. You know what? I have a theory. I believe that wealth and grace are connected, that the refinement of the upper class is a real, tangible thing. Let's conduct an experiment. He turned to the stunned orchestra conductor. Play a waltz. The most beautiful waltz you know. The conductor hesitated, but a sharp glare from Harrison sent him scrambling. The soft, elegant notes of a Viennese waltz began to fill the hall. The melody was beautiful, but in this context, it felt menacing. Harrison turned back to Carol, his smile widening. "Here is the deal, cleaning lady. I want you to dance. Right here. Right now. In front of everyone." The crowd gasped. Some people laughed out loud, thinking it a fantastic joke. Others shifted uncomfortably. This had crossed a line from arrogance into pure cruelty. Carol looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "Sir, please. I can't." "Oh, I think you can," Harrison said smoothly. "And to make it interesting, let's make a little wager." He raised his voice for the entire room to hear. "It's for the foundation, of course. A bit of fun." He paused for dramatic effect. "If you can dance this waltz, right now, with more grace than my wife, I will donate $100 million to the charity of your choice." A wave of murmurs and shocked laughter swept through the ballroom. $100 million. The sum was so ludicrous, so impossibly large, that it made the joke even crueler. It was a number meant to highlight the vast, unbridgeable chasm between his world and hers. He was making a promise he knew he would never have to keep. His wife, Beatrice Vanderbilt, a woman who looked like she was sculpted from ice, glided to his side. "Harrison, darling, what are you doing?" she murmured, though her eyes danced with amusement. "Teaching a lesson, my dear. A lesson in natural order." He looked back at Carol, whose face was now ashen. "So what will it be? Dance, and maybe, just maybe, you'll earn a fortune. Or refuse, and I'll make sure you never work in this city again." His voice was low, but the threat was crystal clear. Blackmail. Publicly and without shame. Carol stood frozen, trapped between impossible choices. The weight of every eye in the room pressed down on her. The mocking music swirled around her. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, silent drops of humiliation that she couldn't stop. She was breaking. In front of everyone, she was shattering into a million pieces. And it was in that moment, as the first sob escaped her lips, that a small, clear voice cut through the tension. "She won't dance." The voice was not loud, but it had the sharp, ringing clarity of a small silver bell. The entire room turned towards the sound. Emily Peterson stepped out of the shadows of the service corridor and walked onto the edge of the grand ballroom floor. Her back was straight, her chin was up, and her sky-blue eyes were fixed on Harrison Vanderbilt with an intensity that was startling in a child. She walked until she was standing in front of her mother, placing herself between Carol and the billionaire. "She won't dance," Emily repeated, her voice steady despite the thunderous beating of her heart. "But I will." A profound, absolute silence descended upon the ballroom. Harrison Vanderbilt stared at the 10-year-old girl, his jaw slack with disbelief. The orchestra faltered, the beautiful waltz dissolving into a few confused, discordant notes before stopping completely. 200 of New York's richest and most powerful people stared at the small, blonde girl in the simple cotton dress who had just accepted an impossible challenge on behalf of her mother. The game had just changed, and no one, least of all Harrison Vanderbilt, knew the new rules. The silence in the ballroom stretched for a long, heavy moment. It was finally broken by Harrison Vanderbilt, who let out a short, barking laugh. The sound was sharp and ugly. Some of his guests, taking it as a cue, joined in with nervous, sycophantic chuckles. Well, what have we here?" Harrison said, recovering his composure and turning the full force of his condescending gaze onto Emily. "A little lion cub has come to defend her mother. How touching, how utterly pathetic." He crouched down, bringing his face uncomfortably close to Emily's. She didn't flinch. She simply stared back, her expression unreadable. "What's your name, little girl?" "Emily Peterson," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Emily Peterson," he repeated, savoring the name as if it were a cheap wine. "And you think you can dance? You, a child in scuffed shoes, think you can compete in a challenge meant for your mother?" "My mother is tired," Emily said simply. "She works too hard. But I know how to dance. My grandpa taught me." This statement struck Harrison as hilarious. Did he now? Your grandpa? Was he a dance instructor at some back-alley studio? The laughter in the room grew louder, more confident. The tension had broken, replaced by the giddy cruelty of a mob that had found a new, even more vulnerable target. Carol rushed to Emily's side, grabbing her small shoulders. "Emily, no? Sweetheart, come with me. Let's go home." Her voice was a frantic whisper, her eyes pleading. She tried to pull Emily away, back into the safety of the shadows, but Emily stood her ground. "No, Mom," she said, her eyes never leaving Harrison's. "He made you cry. A man isn't supposed to make people cry like that. Grandpa said that bullies only win when good people do nothing." The mention of her grandfather, Sergeant Frank Peterson Sr., sent a jolt through Carol. She looked at her daughter's determined stance, the straightness of her spine, and for a moment, she didn't see a 10-year-old girl. She saw the echo of her father-in-law, a man who had faced down enemy fire and never once took a step backward. She saw his integrity, his unbreakable spirit, living on in this tiny, fierce child. Her grip on Emily's shoulders loosened. Harrison, meanwhile, was thoroughly enjoying the new turn of events. This was better than he could have possibly planned. Humiliating a maid was one thing, but humiliating a child? The spectacle would be legendary. He stood up straight and addressed the room, his voice booming with theatrical generosity. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have a new contestant. Little Emily Peterson believes she can dance for her mother's honor. And for $100 million. He paused, letting the absurdity of the statement sink in. "I am a man of my word. The offer stands. If this child can dance the waltz with more grace and skill than my wife, Beatrice, I will make the donation." Beatrice Vanderbilt glided forward. She was a former amateur ballroom champion, a woman who spent 3 days a week with a private tutor from Vienna. She looked Emily up and down, a venomous smile playing on her lips. "This is absurd, Harrison. It's like pitting a racehorse against a stray puppy. It's hardly a competition." "Nonsense, darling," Harrison boomed. "It's entertainment. And we need to set the standard, don't we? You will dance first. Show our little guest what real grace looks like." He then turned back to Emily, his eyes glinting with malice. "But every wager needs stakes on both sides. The $100 million is what you win. We must decide what you lose." He tapped his chin, pretending to think. "I know. When you fail, and you will fail, make no mistake, your mother will not be fired. That's too simple." Instead, his voice dropped, becoming silky and cruel. "She will get on her hands and knees and personally polish the shoes of every single guest in this room. With her own apron. Tonight." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This time, there was no laughter. The cruelty was now so naked, so profound, that it made even the most callous of his guests shift in their seats. He wasn't just humiliating Carol. He was demanding her complete and utter debasement. He was asking her to sacrifice her last shred of dignity in front of her own child. Carol's face went white. "No," she choked out. "You can't. She's just a child. This is between you and me." "It was," Harrison corrected her smoothly. "Until your daughter stepped in. These are the terms. Accept them, or leave here tonight with no job and no prospects. I will personally see to it." He had them trapped, cornered. The choice was between a slow, painful financial ruin or a swift, soul-crushing humiliation. Before Carol could say another word, Emily spoke. "I accept." The words hung in the air, defiant and clear. Carol looked at her daughter in horror, but Emily's expression was calm. It was the calm of a soldier who had already calculated the risks and decided to advance. "Excellent." Harrison clapped his hands together. "The puppy has teeth. Or at least it thinks it does. Let's get this show on the road." As Beatrice began to warm up near the dance floor, doing a few elegant stretches to show off her training, a man quietly moved through the crowd. He was David Miller, the hotel's head of security for over 30 years. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a quiet demeanor and eyes that missed nothing. He had served in the army with Frank Peterson Sr. They had been friends. He had known Carol's husband, and he had met Emily a few times when she was a little girl. He had watched this entire, horrifying scene unfold from the back of the room, his anger a slow, burning fire. He approached Carol, who was now standing helplessly by the wall, watching in a state of shock as her daughter prepared to face the lions. "Carol," David said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Is she sure about this?" "I don't know, David," Carol whispered, her voice breaking. "She's so stubborn, just like her grandfather. She gets an idea in her head." "Frank was the bravest man I ever knew," David said, his gaze fixed on Emily. "He used to talk about her all the time. He said she was special. He said she had a gift." He looked closer at Emily, who was standing motionless at the edge of the dance floor. She wasn't looking at the crowd or at Beatrice. Her eyes were closed, her hands loosely at her sides. She seemed to be gathering herself, drawing strength from some deep, inner well. What did he teach her? David asked softly. He called it story dancing, Carol murmured, remembering. He said that dance wasn't about fancy steps. It was about telling the truth without words. He made up routines for her. One about a lonely soldier, one about a bird learning to fly. I haven't seen her dance like that in years. David nodded slowly. He had a feeling this would be no ordinary dance. He discreetly pulled out his phone, positioning himself to get a clear view of the dance floor and, more importantly, of Harrison Vanderbilt. He pressed the record button. Whatever happened next, the world was going to see it. On the dance floor, Beatrice was ready. She gave the conductor a nod. The orchestra began to play the Blue Danube, a classic, sweeping waltz. Beatrice began to dance, her movements fluid and technically perfect. She spun across the floor, her expensive gown shimmering under the lights. She was the picture of aristocratic elegance. The guests applauded politely. She was exactly what they expected, beautiful, skilled, and utterly devoid of soul. Her dance was a performance of privilege, a demonstration of lessons well learned and paid for. It was impressive, but it was hollow. She finished with a flourish and a confident smile, curtsying to the audience. Harrison applauded the loudest, a smug, triumphant look on his face. Bravo, my dear. An exquisite performance. That is the standard to beat. He gestured dramatically towards Emily. And now, for our main event. The little mouse takes the stage. The laughter was back, but it was more subdued now. A nervous anticipation had settled over the room. Emily walked to the center of the vast, empty dance floor. She looked impossibly small and alone under the glare of the chandeliers. The contrast between Beatrice's shimmering gown and Emily's simple dress, between Beatrice's confident smile and Emily's solemn expression, was stark. The conductor looked at her. "What song would you like, little one?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Emily looked at the orchestra, her blue eyes scanning the musicians. Then she said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "Do you know Amazing Grace?" A confused murmur went through the crowd. Amazing Grace? That wasn't a waltz. It was a hymn. It was slow, mournful, and completely unsuitable for the challenge. Harrison laughed dismissively. The child doesn't even know what a waltz is. This is perfect. Play it. Play the funeral dirge. The conductor looked uncertain, but Emily gave him a small, reassuring nod. He sighed and turned to his musicians, giving them quiet instructions. After a moment, the lone, haunting sound of a violin filled the air, playing the first few bars of the beloved hymn. It was a melody of sorrow, but also of hope. Emily closed her eyes. She did not assume a classic ballet or ballroom stance. Instead, she stood with her feet slightly apart, her arms at her sides, as if listening to a voice only she could hear. In her mind, she was back in her grandfather's small living room. She could hear his voice, gravelly and kind. "Don't let them see your fear, little soldier. Let them see your story. Now, show me the story of the fallen sparrow who learned to fly again." As the first full verse of the music began, Emily moved. It was not a dance of celebration. It was a dance of survival. Her first movement was a stumble, a deliberate, heartbreaking fall to her knees. Her small body curled into a ball on the cold, unforgiving marble, a perfect imitation of a bird with a broken wing. It was a posture of defeat, of utter despair. It was her mother, kneeling amidst the broken glass just moments before. It was every person in that room who had ever felt small, helpless, and broken by the cruelty of the world. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. This was not the clumsy fumbling they had expected. This was something else entirely. Then, slowly, to the mournful notes of the violin, one hand reached out, fingers trembling, grasping at the air. Her body uncurled, not with a smooth, practiced motion, but with a shuddering effort. It was the struggle to rise after being knocked down. Her muscles strained, her face a mask of concentration. She pushed herself up, her legs unsteady, wobbling as she found her feet. She stood, fragile and uncertain, a tiny soldier in the center of a vast battlefield. Harrison Vanderbilt watched, his arms crossed, a smirk still fixed on his face. But the smirk was beginning to feel tight, unnatural. He had expected a child shuffling her feet, a comical display of incompetence. This, this was a performance. It was strange, unsettling, and it was capturing the attention of his guests in a way Beatrice's technically perfect waltz had not. As the music swelled into its first chorus, a melody of profound sorrow and resilient faith, Emily's movements changed. She began to move across the floor, not in the graceful, gliding steps of a waltz, but with a series of sharp, almost militaristic motions. Her arms cut through the air, her feet stamped the floor in a rhythm that was both defiant and disciplined. These were the steps her grandfather had taught her, the movements he had designed to build strength and precision. It was the story of a soldier, alone and outnumbered, facing an overwhelming enemy. Each step was a battle, each turn a confrontation. She wasn't dancing to the music. The music seemed to be dancing to her. The orchestra, captivated by the raw emotion of her performance, began to follow her lead. The tempo rose and fell with the intensity of her movements. The lone violin was joined by the cellos, their deep, somber tones adding a layer of gravity to the air. Carol watched, tears streaming down her face. But these were not tears of humiliation. They were tears of astonishment and a fierce, surging pride. She recognized the story. It was the one Sergeant Peterson had called The Last Stand. It was the story he had told Emily about a single soldier holding a pass against impossible odds, not for glory, but to protect the people behind him. In this grand ballroom, her daughter was that soldier. She was holding the pass, protecting her mother from the enemy. The dance shifted again. The sharp, combative movements softened. Emily's arms opened wide, her body swaying with a gentle, lyrical grace. She was a bird, testing its mended wing. A series of small, hopeful leaps became larger, more confident. She began to spin, not the tight, controlled pirouettes of a ballerina, but wide, joyful circles, her blonde hair flying out like a halo. She was no longer fighting. She was flying. She was free. The pain and struggle of the first part of her dance were being transformed, redeemed by this soaring, breathtaking expression of hope. The crowd was utterly captivated. The whispers had died. The nervous laughter was a distant memory. No one was looking at their phones. No one was thinking about their stock portfolios or their summer homes in the Hamptons. Every single person was watching the little girl in the simple dress who was telling a story more profound and more moving than any they had ever seen on a Broadway stage. They were seeing their own struggles, their own secret heartbreaks, their own moments of resilience played out on the marble floor. They saw their mothers, their daughters, their own younger selves who had dared to dream in the face of a cold, indifferent world. And in the collective gaze of 200 of New York's most cynical and powerful people, something remarkable happened. They began to feel. David Miller, standing by the back wall, kept his phone steady, his knuckles white. He saw the sergeant in every step Emily took. He saw his friend's iron will, his unshakable integrity, his belief that true strength came not from wealth or power, but from courage and love. He wasn't just recording a video, he was bearing witness. The only person in the room who seemed immune to the magic was Harrison Vanderbilt. His face had gone from smug amusement to confused irritation, and finally, to a dark, simmering rage. This was not how his game was supposed to go. The child was supposed to be a clown, an object of ridicule. But she wasn't. She was a prodigy. She was a star. And she was stealing the spotlight at his party, in his hotel, turning his carefully orchestrated spectacle of cruelty against him. She was making him look like a fool, not through clumsiness, but through a talent so immense it was undeniable. His guests were not laughing at her, they were mesmerized by her. He could feel the mood in the room shifting, turning against him. The admiration in their eyes was an indictment of his own boorish behavior. As the final, soaring notes of amazing grace filled the hall, Emily's dance came to an end. She finished not with a bow or a curtsy, but by standing perfectly still in the center of the floor, her chest rising and falling with her breath, her head held high. She slowly lowered her arms and looked directly, not at the audience, but at one man. Her sky-blue eyes, clear and unwavering, locked onto Harrison Vanderbilt. There was no fear in her gaze. There was no anger. There was only a quiet, powerful question. For a full 10 seconds, the ballroom was shrouded in a silence so complete it was like a physical presence. It was a silence of awe, of reverence. Then, one person began to clap. It was an elderly woman in the front row, a respected philanthropist known for her quiet dignity. Her solitary applause was followed by another, and then, like a tidal wave, the room erupted. It was not polite applause. It was a roar. It was a standing ovation. People were on their feet, their faces alight with an emotion that had been absent all evening, genuine admiration. They were clapping for the child, for her courage, for her astonishing gift. They were clapping for the beauty and truth she had brought into this cold, sterile room. Carol sobbed openly, her hand covering her mouth, her heart feeling like it would burst with love and pride. The applause went on, a deafening tribute to the small girl who had stared down a giant and won. Harrison Vanderbilt stood frozen in the eye of the storm, his face a thunderous mask of fury. The sound of the applause was a physical assault. It was a judgment. It was the sound of him losing control. "Stop," he roared, his voice barely audible over the din. "Stop it." Slowly, reluctantly, the applause died down, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. The guests turned to look at him, their expressions no longer sycophantic, but questioning, challenging. "What is wrong with you people?" Harrison snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "You're applauding a circus act. That was not a waltz. That was flailing. She did not fulfill the conditions of the wager." He pointed a trembling finger at Emily. "The challenge was to dance the waltz with more grace than my wife. She failed. The wager is off. And as for the consequences..." He turned a venomous glare on Carol. Your daughter made a deal. You will honor it. Get on your knees." A wave of shock and disgust rippled through the audience. They had just witnessed something beautiful, something transcendent, and Harrison's response was to double down on his cruelty. He had completely misjudged the room. The spell of his power was broken. "I don't think so, Harrison." The voice came from the back of the room. It was calm, authoritative, and it belonged to a man who had not spoken all evening. General Marcus Thorne, a retired four-star general and a highly respected member of the city's old guard, began to walk forward. He was a man in his late 70s, with a ramrod-straight posture and eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and had not blinked. He was one of the few people in New York whose influence and reputation rivaled Vanderbilt's. When he spoke, people listened. "That girl showed more grace in 5 minutes than you've shown in your entire life," the general said, his voice cold as steel. He stopped beside Emily, placing a gentle, protective hand on her shoulder. He looked down at her, and his stern expression softened for a moment. "That was quite a display, young lady. Your grandfather would have been proud." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You knew my grandpa?" "I did," the general said, his voice softening. "I had the honor of serving with Sergeant Frank Peterson. He was one of the finest men I ever knew. He saved my life and the lives of 5 other men during the Battle of Fallujah. He ran through enemy fire, with no regard for his own safety, to pull us out of a burning vehicle. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery." He turned his piercing gaze back to Harrison Vanderbilt, and now his voice was laced with a quiet, deadly fury. "That man, Harrison, was a hero, a true American hero. And you worthless, arrogant bully, have spent the evening trying to humiliate his family. You tried to debase his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter in front of 200 people for your own sick amusement." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The little girl who had just danced for them was not just any child. She was the granddaughter of a Medal of Honor recipient. A legend. The story had just taken on a whole new dimension. The disrespect shown by Harrison was no longer just a personal cruelty. It was an insult to the memory of a national hero. Harrison's face had gone pale. He had known, of course, that Carol's last name was Peterson, but it was a common name. He had never made the connection. He had stepped on a landmine he never knew was there. The general wasn't finished. "The wager," he continued, his voice ringing with authority, "was about grace. And grace, Mr. Vanderbilt, is not about perfect dance steps or expensive dresses. It is about dignity under pressure. It is about courage in the face of cruelty. It is about honor. By that definition, this child has not only met the conditions of your challenge, she has surpassed them in a way you are clearly incapable of understanding." He turned to address the silent, watchful crowd. "I, for one, believe the wager was won. And I will personally pledge the first $10 million to whatever charity Mrs. Peterson chooses. Before the words were even fully out of his mouth, the elderly philanthropist who had started the applause spoke up. And I will pledge another $5 million. A third voice called out, "Count me in for 5. And then another, and another. It was a cascade. Pledges began flying from every corner of the ballroom. It was a spontaneous, overwhelming rebellion against Harrison Vanderbilt. His guests, the very people whose approval he craved, were publicly and enthusiastically siding with his victim. They were not just donating money, they were casting a vote. They were voting against him. Within minutes, the pledges had soared past 50 million, then 75, then 100. They were collectively, joyfully, fulfilling the promise that Harrison had made as a joke, turning his cruel wager into a stunning reality. Harrison Vanderbilt stood alone in the center of the room, his wife having discreetly melted back into the crowd. His face was a canvas of disbelief, fury, and for the first time in his life, a creeping, unfamiliar feeling, utter and complete humiliation. The power he had wielded so arrogantly all night had vanished. The room, his room, was no longer his. It belonged to the maid and her daughter. David Miller stopped recording. He had more than enough. He quietly sent the file to a journalist friend at the New York Times with a simple message: "You're not going to believe this." Emily stood beside the general, her small hand now holding his. She looked at her mother, who was being surrounded by well-wishers, women in diamonds and silk who were now patting her arm and telling her how proud she must be. Carol was crying and laughing at the same time, her face transformed by a joy so profound it seemed to erase years of hardship. Then, Emily looked back at Harrison Vanderbilt. He looked small now, pathetic and isolated in his own glittering ballroom. She felt a strange pang in her chest. It wasn't triumph. It was something closer to pity. Her grandfather had taught her about fighting, but he had also taught her about victory. "A real soldier never gloats, little one," he had said. "When the battle is over, you show respect. That's what separates us from the monsters." She let go of the general's hand and walked across the floor one last time. She stopped a few feet in front of the billionaire who had tried to destroy her family. Harrison looked down at her, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "What do you want?" he spat. Emily didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, her gaze clear and steady. Then she did something no one expected. She curtsied. It was a small, simple, perfect curtsy, a gesture of traditional respect. "Thank you, Mr. Vanderbilt," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You've helped a lot of people tonight." And with that final, devastating act of grace, she turned her back on him and walked away, leaving him to drown in the ruins of his own making. The battle was over. The little soldier had won. The grand ballroom, which only an hour ago had been a stage for Harrison Vanderbilt's power, was now the scene of his undoing. The guests, his guests, were no longer looking at him. They were clustered around Carol and Emily, their checkbooks and phones out, making good on their pledges. General Thorne stood guard like a sentinel, his presence a clear and immovable shield around the mother and daughter. Mr. Davies, the hotel manager who had been terrified of Harrison just a short while ago, now bustled about with an officious air, offering Carol a comfortable chair and bringing Emily a glass of lemonade. His actions a clear signal of where the hotel's allegiance now lay. Harrison stood rooted to the spot, a statue of impotent rage. He watched as his carefully constructed universe crumbled around him. The air, once thick with deference to his name, was now filled with whispers that stung like hornets. "Disgraceful. Son of a hero. Did you see his face? Serves him right." Each phrase was a small hammer blow against the fragile ego of a man who had never known anything but worship. He tried to salvage the situation. He strode towards the largest group, attempting a jovial, dismissive laugh. "Well, it seems our little charity event was more successful than I could have imagined," he boomed, his voice strained. Who knew a little maid's dance could be so profitable? No one laughed. The crowd simply parted, their backs turning to him, creating a silent, moving wall that excluded him completely. He was a ghost at his own party. The message was clear. His money could no longer buy their respect. Beatrice, his wife, materialized at his elbow. Her face was a frozen mask of fury. "You have made us a laughingstock, Harrison," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You and your pathetic, brutish games. You didn't just humiliate yourself. You humiliated me. Our name will be mud by morning." "They're fools," he snarled back, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "In a week, they will have forgotten all about it. They'll come crawling back." "Will they?" she asked, her voice dripping with ice. "Or will they be lining up to do business with General Thorne and his newfound protege, the heroic orphan of America's greatest soldier? You haven't just lost a room, you fool. You've lost the narrative." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him utterly alone in a sea of his own making. Meanwhile, General Thorne was making arrangements. He had quietly called his personal driver and arranged for a discreet exit for Carol and Emily through a private service elevator. A team from his foundation was already on the phone with Carol, gently walking her through the process of setting up a trust for the donated funds. The sum had officially reached $127 million. "We need to get you and your daughter home," the general said to Carol, his voice kind but firm. "The press will be here soon. It's best if you're not here when they arrive." Carol, still dazed, could only nod. The events of the evening felt like a surreal dream. She looked at Emily, who was now sitting beside the elderly philanthropist, calmly explaining one of her grandfather's favorite dance stories. She seemed completely unfazed by the whirlwind of attention. She had done what she had set out to do. She had protected her mother. For her, the battle was over. David Miller approached the general. "Sir, the car is waiting downstairs. I'll escort them." "Thank you, David," the general said, shaking his hand firmly. "You did a good thing tonight. Frank would be proud of you, too." He then crouched down in front of Emily. "Young lady," he said, "you are a remarkable person. I have a feeling this is just the beginning of your story." Emily smiled, a real, genuine smile for the first time that night. "Thank you, sir, for helping my mom. She has a good daughter," the general replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's the best help she could ask for." Escorted by David, Carol and Emily slipped out of the ballroom, leaving behind the glittering chaos and the simmering rage of Harrison Vanderbilt. They rode the service elevator down to the basement parking garage, the silence a stark contrast to the noise upstairs. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. They didn't speak on the ride home in the general's plush-town car. Carol simply held Emily's hand, her thumb stroking the back of her daughter's small, strong fingers. The numbers, the pledges, the standing ovation, it all felt secondary. The one thing that shone with brilliant clarity in her mind was the image of her daughter, small and defiant, stepping out of the shadows to stand for her. The monster of debt that had haunted their lives, that had woken Carol in a cold sweat night after night, had been slain. Not by a prince or a fairy godmother, but by a 10-year-old girl with lightning in her feet and steel in her spine. When they arrived at their small, third-floor walk-up apartment, the place looked exactly the same, but everything was different. The worn sofa, the dripping faucet, the stack of unpaid medical bills on the kitchen table, they had lost their power. They were just things, not threats. Carol tucked Emily into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. "You were so brave tonight, sweetie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I have never been so proud in my entire life." Emily looked up at her, her eyes heavy with sleep. "I love you, Mom," she murmured. "I love you too, my little dancer," Carol whispered back, kissing her forehead. "More than all the stars in the sky." She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her daughter sleep. Then she walked to the kitchen table, picked up the terrifying stack of bills, and, with a sense of ceremony, dropped them into the trash can. It was the beginning of a new life. By 8 a.m. the next morning, the story was everywhere. The video David Miller had sent to his journalist friend had not just been published, it had exploded. It was the lead story on every news website, every morning show, every social media platform. The headline in the New York Times read, "Vanderbilt's Folly. Billionaire humiliated by Maid's daughter in $127 million charity dance-off." The video was devastating. It showed Harrison's cruelty in stark, undeniable detail. His sneering words, his public blackmail, his rage-filled attempt to deny Emily her victory. It was all there for the world to see. In contrast, Emily's quiet dignity and her breathtaking, emotional dance were even more powerful on screen. The internet fell in love with her. She was dubbed the Vanderbilt Waltz Girl, a symbol of courage and grace. Memes were created. Harrison's furious face next to Emily's calm one, with captions like "Grace under fire" and "The real rich." The backlash against Harrison Vanderbilt was immediate and catastrophic. The stock price of Vanderbilt holdings plummeted by 30% at the opening bell. Sponsors of the Vanderbilt Foundation Gala began pulling their support, issuing public statements condemning Mr. Vanderbilt's abhorrent behavior. The board of directors of 3 major corporations on which he sat called emergency meetings. By noon, he had been asked to resign from all of them. His social world evaporated. Invitations were rescinded. Phone calls went unreturned. The powerful friends who had laughed at his cruel jokes the night before were now publicly distancing themselves from him, treating him like a contagion. In the brutal, unforgiving calculus of public opinion, Harrison Vanderbilt had become a liability. He was no longer a king. He was a pariah. For Carol and Emily, the world had also turned upside down, but in the most wonderful way. Their small apartment building was besieged by news vans. Bouquets of flowers from anonymous well-wishers crowded the hallway. General Thorne had provided them with a lawyer and a financial advisor, who were now managing the flood of requests and the logistics of the newly formed Peterson Grace Foundation. Carol, with the general's guidance, had chosen the charity. The foundation's mission would be to provide financial aid to families buried by medical debt and to fund arts programs, specifically dance programs, for underprivileged children. The story had touched a nerve across the country, and donations from the public began to pour in, swelling the foundation's endowment even further. Life changed in 1,000 small and large ways. The first thing Carol did was quit her job at the hotel, submitting a simple, dignified letter of resignation. She then paid off every penny of their debt. For the first time in years, she felt the crushing weight lift from her shoulders. She could breathe again. They moved from their small, cramped apartment to a comfortable, sunny house in a quiet neighborhood with a small backyard. It wasn't a mansion, but to them, it felt like a palace. The most important feature of the new house was a room with a polished hardwood floor and a wall of mirrors. It was Emily's dance studio. Emily was offered scholarships to every prestigious dance school in the country, from Juilliard to the School of American Ballet. But after visiting several, she made a decision that surprised everyone. She chose a smaller, less famous school run by a retired Russian prima ballerina named Madame Anya Volkov. Madame Volkov was known for her focus not just on technique, but on the emotional storytelling of dance, the very thing Sergeant Peterson had instilled in Emily. When they met, the elderly woman watched Emily dance for a full 10 minutes in silence. Then she simply said, "You have an old soul, child. You do not dance to impress. You dance because you must. This is a rare gift. I will teach you how to protect it." Emily thrived under Madame Volkov's tutelage. She learned the discipline of classical ballet, the freedom of modern dance, and the intricate rhythms of a dozen other styles. But she never lost the raw, emotional core of her grandfather's teaching. Her dancing was a unique fusion of military precision and breathtaking grace, a style that was hers and hers alone. She remained grounded, despite the fame. General Thorne acted as a grandfather figure, shielding her from the worst of the media glare and ensuring she had as normal a childhood as possible. She went to school, made friends, did her homework, and spent her evenings and weekends in her studio, pouring all the joy and sorrow and wonder of her young life into her movements. The world watched her grow up. Occasional news stories would show her winning competitions, her talent blossoming into something truly world-class. She never gave interviews about that night at the hotel, but she didn't have to. Her dancing said it all. It spoke of strength born from hardship, of beauty found in unexpected places, of the quiet, unshakable power of a loving heart. And Harrison Vanderbilt? He disappeared from public life. He and Beatrice divorced. He sold his company at a massive loss and retired to a private island, a king in a kingdom of one. Sometimes, late at night, when the news would show a clip of a now teenage Emily Peterson soaring across a stage, he would watch, his face a mixture of resentment and a strange, grudging awe. He had tried to make her small, but instead, he had made her limitless. He had set out to prove that grace was a product of wealth, but she had proven it was a product of the soul. He had joked about giving her $100 million, and in the end, that was exactly what it had cost him. He had lost a fortune, but he had lost so much more. He had lost his name, his power, and the one thing he could never get back, his story. Because his story was no longer his. It was, and would forever be, a footnote in the story of the girl who danced. 5 years later, the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House was dark. A single spotlight cut through the blackness, illuminating a lone figure in the center. She was no longer a girl, but a young woman of 17. Emily Peterson had grown into her grandfather's descriptions. The lightning in her feet was now a controlled, explosive power that captivated audiences around the world. The steel in her spine was visible in her flawless posture, her unwavering confidence, her command of the stage. Tonight was the premiere of her first original production, a full-length ballet she had choreographed herself. It was titled The Last Stand. In the audience, Carol watched from the front row, seated between General Thorne and a beaming Madame Volkov. Carol was a different woman now. The lines of exhaustion on her face had been replaced by the soft glow of purpose and peace. She was the respected director of the Peterson Grace Foundation, an organization that had, in 5 short years, helped thousands of families escape the crushing prison of medical debt. It had also built and funded dozens of Grace studios, free dance schools in impoverished neighborhoods across the country, ensuring that children with a gift would never have it silenced by a lack of money. She was no longer invisible. She was a force for good, her quiet strength now amplified, touching countless lives. The ballet began. It was the story of that night, retold not with words, but with the universal language of movement. The first act depicted a world of cold, sharp angles and arrogant, strutting figures in glittering costumes. The lead male dancer, representing Harrison Vanderbilt, was a whirlwind of aggressive, domineering movements, his choreography a brilliant, scathing critique of empty power. The corps de ballet, representing the party guests, moved like puppets, their actions dictated by the lead. Then, a small, solitary dancer entered the stage. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace, clearing away the props left by the others. It was the maid. Another dancer, portraying a young Emily, watched from the shadows. The audience was silent, completely enthralled. The pivotal scene arrived. The confrontation. The music, a powerful, modern score composed specifically for the ballet, swelled with dramatic tension. When the Vanderbilt character turned his fury on the maid, the dancer portraying Emily stepped forward. The music stopped. A single, haunting violin began to play amazing grace. And then, Emily Peterson danced. She danced the story of the fallen sparrow. She danced the story of the lone soldier. She danced the story of her mother's pain and her own fierce, protective love. It was the same dance from that night in the ballroom, but it was deeper, richer, imbued with 5 more years of life, of training, of understanding. It was a masterpiece of emotional storytelling. On the vast stage of the Met, her performance was not just a personal memory. It became a universal anthem of defiance against cruelty, of hope against despair. When the final note faded and Emily stood, poised and triumphant, in the single spotlight, the silence held for a beat. Then the theater exploded. The applause was a physical force, a tidal wave of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. It was a roar of recognition, of admiration, of love. Roses rained down on the stage. Backstage, after the 17th curtain call, Emily was wrapped in a hug by her mother. "He would be so proud of you, sweetie," Carol whispered, her eyes shining. Not just for the dancing, for the story. General Thorne, his own eyes suspiciously moist, simply squeezed her shoulder. "You honored him tonight, Emily. You honored all of them." A week later, a letter arrived at the Peterson Grace Foundation. It was addressed to Emily. The envelope was made of cheap paper, the postmark from a small, forgotten town in the Caribbean. The handwriting inside was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "Miss Peterson, I saw a report about your ballet on the news. They showed a clip of your performance. It was remarkable. I live a very quiet life now. The world has forgotten me, and that is for the best. For a long time, I was consumed by a bitterness so profound I thought it would be the end of me. I lost everything I valued, my money, my name, my wife, my so-called friends. I deserved to lose it all. What I didn't understand that night, and for many years after, was that I had lost the most important thing long before I ever met you. I had lost my own humanity. In my world, People were objects, tools to be used for my own advancement and amusement. Kindness was a weakness. Cruelty was a form of power. You taught me, and the entire world, how wrong I was. Your dance that night was not an attack. It was a lesson. I was not a worthy student at the time, but the years have a way of forcing you to learn. I do not write this letter asking for your forgiveness. That is something I have no right to ask for. I write simply to acknowledge a truth it has taken me a lifetime to understand. Grace is not something you can buy. It is something you must build within yourself, often from the ashes of your own mistakes. Your dance showed me that. Thank you. Sincerely, H. Vanderbilt. Emily read the letter twice, then handed it to her mother. Carol read it, her expression thoughtful. It seems, she said softly, that even a fallen sparrow can learn to fly again. Emily folded the letter and put it away. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet sense of closure. The final ghost of that night had been laid to rest. The next day, Emily was at one of the Foundation's newest Grace studios in the Bronx. She was not there as a star, but as a teacher. She moved among a group of wide-eyed 10-year-olds, adjusting a small girl's posture, offering a word of encouragement to a shy boy in the back. She was showing them the first steps of a simple routine. It was a dance her grandfather had created for her years ago. It was a story about planting a seed in hard ground and tending to it with patience and love, until, against all odds, it grows into something beautiful and strong. As the children danced, their faces alight with the pure, uncomplicated joy of movement, Emily watched them, her heart full. This, she realized, was the true victory. It wasn't the applause or the fame. It wasn't the downfall of a cruel man. It was this. It was passing the gift on. It was ensuring that the legacy of Sergeant Frank Peterson Sr., a legacy of courage, integrity, and grace under fire, would live on, not just in a world-famous ballet, but here, in the hopeful, stomping feet of a new generation of dancers. The battle had been won that night in the ballroom, but the story, her story, their story, would be told forever. In every child who found their strength, in every family lifted from despair, in every note of a haunting hymn that promised that even when you are lost, you can still be found. The dance would go on. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.